disquiet now. We're starting this round table tonight. It's called Free Speech 2018, and it's put on by Campaign for Truth, who, as you know, have a habit of just jumping in with roundtables when there's a topic of discussion in the news, and free speech is very much in the news at the moment. So we've got our guests here sitting around the round table. We'll start here with Pastor Daniel Scot, who's come in especially from Australia to come and speak with us. We've got Gloria Greenfield, the film producer. We've got we've got Richard Landes, our friend, we've met him before. And we've got here Charlie Ball, the broadcaster. So we've got Ambrosine on the other side there who's going to say hello to you. Hello. Today. So we'll start with Pastor Daniel Scot.
Thank you very much for everyone to be here. I originally come from Pakistan. I was a professor in mathematics. A Muslim professor tried to convert me to Islam. I refused to convert. So they filed a case under Blasphemy Law 295C, which kept death sentence. Under that situation, I left from Pakistan, went to Australia. I was teaching at University of Queensland. But I felt that Islam is growing. They want Syria, so I left teaching mathematics from University of Queensland in 1994, came in full-time ministry. So I have been writing. Muslims don't like my writing and my speaking, so they took me to court in Australia. I have a court case battle for 5 years, and the case was that I'm making public the teaching of Quran and Hadith. Muslims want to hide it till they are in power to destroy people and kill. So that's why the problem was they saying don't make it public. And but thank God I won it in Supreme Court. I lost in the tribunal. The judge favored Muslim. He made 213 errors in the judgment. Probably they have a bribe. We don't know what was the reason behind that. But in the Supreme Court, there were 3 judges, and they found that the judgment was wrong. They canceled the judgment, disqualified the judge for hearing such a case, and ordered him to prepare for the damages. So it was like, you're not free. I was told 3 times in the courtroom, don't read from Quran and Hadith. You may be insulting Muslim people. And my response was, if reading of Quran and Hadith is insulting Muslim people, why these books are here? I mean, ban these books, because they are the one insulting Muslim, not one somebody who reads it. So it was a very strange case. But the case is that Muslims don't want you to know the truth about their religion, so that they can convert you, and when they get power, then they can kill you. So that's basically in a nutshell.
Okay, so Gloria.
I'm going to be speaking as an American Jew, an American Zionist, but I think it's important for me to stress that my experience is as an American, because there's a different reality in the United States than there is in Europe. The late, great Supreme Court jurist Benjamin Cardozo said that freedom of speech is the matrix of all the other freedoms. And I hold by that. And holding by that, causes a bit of tension with some of the actions that people I relate to very much are pursuing. I believe that we must defend freedom of speech. And in order to defend freedom of speech, we cannot take away freedom of speech from others. If we want freedom of speech, we have to maintain it in general. Now, that doesn't mean that that lies should be allowed to be taught in classrooms. The classroom is a very different environment. Accuracy must be taught in classroom, but outside of classrooms and outside of companies, for instance, that have a right to define agreements with their employees about what would be permissible and what wouldn't be permissible. and also governmental issues where security issues are at stake. But the general individual should have freedom of speech. So that leaves me in a very uncomfortable position when I think about criminalizing certain speeches that may benefit us as Jews, but degrade and diminish and make more vulnerable freedom of speech in general. I believe that it is imperative that for those things that we feel are detrimental to civil society to speak about, that we should be able to argue that and show how unacceptable and demented that perspective is, but that we should not try to criminalize it. I came to this, really, a better understanding of this, because as an American I experienced the discrimination and bias that happened through the IRS with conservative and Zionistic organizations. And so what we have to remember is that when we have the type of administration that we trust, then we can say, then we may get a little bit more lax and say, well, we don't have to worry about our rights to freedom of speech being taken away, but you can't always be sure that the administration of whatever country that you're in is going to defend. As a matter of fact, we know, if we look at Europe, that freedom of speech actually is taken away from the side of, I would assume, many of the people in this room. That our speech gets defined as hate, and the haters' speech actually gets defined as just acceptable.
As marginalized and underrepresented voices.
Yes, thank you. So that's where I hold on freedom of speech.
So I come at this from a perspective that as a medievalist, not all medievalists share this with me, but I focus a lot of my attention on what's called by some anthropologists honor-shame culture. And in honor-shame culture, I mean, it's important to understand that the whole move to allow free speech is in fact part of a broader rejection of the dynamics of honor-shame culture, in which not only do people lie to save face, but they'll kill you if you call them a liar. So you have this very strange phenomenon of, for instance, Lancelot in Mallory's version denies that he's having an affair with Guinevere and kills anybody who says he is, and he says, see, I'm innocent, I've killed everybody who accuses me. Before the advent of freedom of speech, a lot of the sort of natural instinct of shutting up people was by people with power who didn't want to be criticized publicly and who felt that criticism of them was not just criticism of something they had done or something that they had said, but an assault on their very being. And I forget which Supreme Court justice in discussing freedom of speech said, you know, in order to have freedom of speech, people have to have thick skins. You've got to be able to take the rough and tumble of having people say things you don't like about you, but you also get to say things that you feel are necessary. And I like the distinction between polite society, in which you don't say certain things lest there be violence, and a civil society in which you can say what you feel you need to say and there won't be violence. Now what I think has happened in the 21st century is that, in a sense, through the back door, the honor-shame issues have reemerged. So, but instead of it being enforced through violence, duels, whatever, it's enforced by a kind of thought police that use issues of sensitivity as justification, so that safe spaces and microaggressions and all these different matters, which are often defined as bigotry. And if you go to The Guardian, for example, and look at what they say about free speech, you know, I have no problem with saying people who are bigoted, they can say what they want, but they certainly shouldn't be invited to speak at a university and so on and so forth. And so you get this phenomenon of shaming people for saying things that offend certain people. And it may have started in other circles, but in the 21st century, the Muslims have jumped on this bandwagon. They've defined what, right back from the beginning, the status of the dhimmi, of the non-Muslim in a Muslim society is, the first rule is do not offend Muslims. Don't criticize Islam. Don't criticize the Prophet, Allah, and certainly don't blaspheme. And they get to determine what's blaspheming, what's offending, and so on. And that's what we have today. We have Islamophobia as a term, which essentially is being defined by Muslims. What offends them, that becomes Islamophobia. They're trying to criminalize it. I gather in certain European countries, I won't talk about England, but I know that in Germany, people have been arrested for saying things that are deemed to be Islamophobic. And you have this bizarre thing, to get back to what Gloria was saying about how a lot of this redounds to, not to the benefit of Zionists and Jews, is that, Jews can't define what's anti-Semitism. So Jeremy Corbyn can say, just because I like Hezbollah and Hamas and because I compare the Israelis to Nazis, I'm just being anti-Zionist, I'm not being anti-Semitic. You don't have a right to tell me that I'm anti-Semitic, but Muslims have a right to tell everybody that they're being Islamophobic, and you end up with what I think it's David Hirsch calls the Livingston formulation. So my sense is that we are now in a very serious situation in which people are silenced, they self-censor. You see that self-censorship, for instance, in the disastrous 15-year reign of the sexual grooming scandal in Rotherham and other places. The self-censorship of people who are afraid to offend Muslims and afraid of the backlash for offending Muslims is disastrous.
I have to agree in large part with especially Gloria and Richard, because I approach this from several different angles as a broadcaster. It's not just Muslims. I have this ability. I call it a God-given gift to offend everybody. I offend people even when I'm not trying. I really offend people even when I'm trying to be nice. Like I said, it's a gift, and I love it. It stirs them up. But it is a form of control. I too look at things from the Second Amendment or the First Amendment and Second Amendment perspective, and I think what people sometimes here in the United Kingdom don't get when we talk, at least from an American perspective, of the Bill of Rights. It's not just a bunch of amendments. And I think it's sort of like amendments are almost like notes at the end of a piece of research. You have it, page 20 and see page 15, or note to whatever. It's like, well, it's like you get like 20 of them. You just put some in, you take some out, take some in, take some out. But the Bill of Rights, especially those first 10 amendments, were already there. All the Bill of Rights were essentially a recognition of something that is there. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed, gifted by their Creator, Hashem, with certain inalienable rights. So the freedom of speech, or anything else, the right to carry and use a pistol in a proper legal way, is a part of me as much as breathing air, as far as I'm concerned. And you can't take off the Second Amendment just because we don't like it, because take rid of the Second Amendment, get rid of the First, get rid of the Fifth, kill, But I have found as a broadcaster that yes, especially here, you have these levels of incredible levels of groups that somehow control the airwaves, and they're sort of unspoken, but you know what you can and cannot talk about. You do not dare bridge the subject of homosexuality, for instance. Now, I personally, I'm in media. I have tons of friends. Some of my best friends are gay. I use that one line with Owen Jones of all people, and it slipped out. But as I said, actually, I was lucky for a period. I had a cousin, a cousin's daughter, so a second cousin, who happened in a lesbian relationship, it was a blessing. Why? Because every time someone said, oh, my best friend says, no, wait, I've got a family member who is a lesbian, so I don't love her any less, But yeah, I have friends who are gay. I've lost friends who are gay. I love them. I cry with them. I laugh with them as much as I would with any dear friend. I just don't believe in the practice. I'm told it's the wrong practice to do. If you want to be gay, that's fine. But that's your right. This was even with Owen Jones. I remember we were discussing gay marriage. I said, Owen. Oh, for those who don't know, Owen is a columnist for, is he the Guardian now?
He's the Guardian.
The Guardian,
in
yes.
mind in my remarks.
Yes. That little storm front that is, little Owen Jones looks like he's about 13 now, and doesn't shut up. And he's Oxford, I think, he's very smart at processing lots of little facts as though wisdom behind it. We can spit out all these little facts, and it's like a junior thing with this thing. But I remember once going on with gay marriage, I said, Owen, you don't need my permission or anyone's permission to be gay or to live with someone. Libertarians say you don't even need the state's permission. The last thing they want is, he said, oh, well, thank you for, and I thought, why are you being such a schmuck to me? I'm trying to back you up by saying you have an inalienable right. But I also have an inalienable right to criticize it. And just while I'm on the subject of this, I think Peter Tatchell, by the way, when we've been talking the discussion of the famous gay cake issues that we've had both in the States and here, Tatchell actually, I think, and I disagree with a lot of what Tatchell says, but I have time for the guy. At least he seems honest in what he believes in and he fights for it. But he very correctly said, if it's against a person is wrong, against an idea is a different thing. So someone saying to a baker, you have to write down on a cake that with homosexual marriage, would be like, to me, like going to Carmeli's and having the second guy at Carmeli's or Daniel's up the road at Kosher Bacon and say, yeah, I want a big cross on it, I want an open heart of Jesus, like the average have, Jesus saves on the bottom. Why would you do that? Why would you? Even from a political standpoint, I think even as Tatchell pointed out, it just doesn't even make political sense. I mean, if you're trying to get together as communities, why would I want to go in and offend someone by saying to a Jewish baker, yeah, I want to, because the law says I can. I want to cross the Jesus on it. I want, Jesus saves and maybe Moses invests down at the bottom. We put that in small, we don't see it. But they will constantly use this to control you. And it's a form of fascism. And, one of the things, and again, something people don't understand when I talk about the First Amendment. The First Amendment has probably had more of a profound effect on the United States' success economically than anywhere else. People go, so how can? Because you can do stupid things. And being stupid is occasionally an important thing because it sets a boundary. I may not like Mapplethorpe and some of my wife's an art critic, and my feelings on a lot of the anti-war art came out during the Iraq War. I didn't think highly of it. The only thing good about it was we had one piece we bought, it was all anti-war stuff, and the thing went up in value like 4 times, and I thought, good, if I sell it one day, I ain't going to miss it. We still have it, unfortunately. But it allows you, well, one day when she's not looking, I'll sell it. But, it is important to be able to, at a table, to say something stupid. And you have someone point out, to think ideas. When Werner von Braun, like Einstein, people like that came to the United States, they could think big, stupid ideas. And some were pretty stupid, and some turned out to be E equals MC squared. They weren't so stupid. You could have Copernicus could come up with an idea, and we weren't too worried about what the Pope was going to do. So we've got to keep hold of that First Amendment. We've got to, allow the other side to have a cogent argument. And that's different from narrative. We need to, the other side works on narrative. And I've seen this on several fronts. One that I happen to know very well in particular, and I'm sure I've gone well over 2 minutes because, yeah, I expected this jockey. This will be my last for the moment. Was I've been watching how sort of activists use agendas, how they use speech to push things. One thing they use, of course, is redefining the term. So it's not gay marriage, it's equal marriage. became equal marriage. And so quickly, just like that, everything changed. I happen to like fox hunting. Not halakhic, I understand. But I happened to took up riding when I lived in Ireland. And one day, the person that I had learned how to ride said, it's time to get a horse of your own. It takes up a state. Actually, before that, she said, if you want to learn how to really ride, you want to come hunting with us. I'm a kid from Boston. I've never, I've been on a horse or two when I was a kid. I've never been hunting. I tried it. And then I got exposed to this whole political thing. And I thought, okay, I'm not the son of a duke or an earl or a marquis or whatever. I'm not a farmer. I'm a tabula rasa. I'm a kid from Boston who knows that. I studied it. I listened to the arguments, and to me, it made sense. And I was happy to accept it. But if you watch the way it was argued, what they do is they take the general public who don't know anything about fox hunting, or anything about maybe Israeli society, or anything about what goes on at the security fence in between Gaza and Israel, or whatever. And I don't expect people to know this, and they feed them narrative. So it now becomes that you have to have the enemy, which is the guys in the red coats, or the big mighty IDF. You have to have victims, the poor little fox. I used to hear these stories about the poor little fox and the big guys in the red coats. And first off, many times, there are times you've seen foxes turn around, literally walk right through a pack of hounds, and I'm going, hounds are generally stupid. It's a pretty fair, actually it's a pretty unfair match between the fox and the hounds. So what they do is you now have people creating what's called the mobocracy. I heard, what's his face, Ben Shapiro, is it Ben Shapiro? Yeah, I heard him use this the other day. It's a term I've heard for years now. And a mobocracy is like a democracy. People use the term democracy. America is not a democracy. We are a republic. And the difference is, in a republic, the minority is respected. So I don't have to, I'm maybe part of the heterosexual majority, as long as people who are gay don't.
Not for long.
Not for long, who knows. As long as people who are gay don't come into the public square, Sharansky talks about the public square and the private square. As long as you keep it to the private square, it's your business. I go hunting on private land, it's my business. But the minute they try and stop us in the public square, that's where there's problems. And this is where we have to be careful, because they will shut you up, and then, yes, the mob will be running the show.
Yeah, I'd like to I'd like to add something to what Richard said, and I think it was right on. But I also think that the language manipulation, the language police, also came from not just the Islamist movements, but also from the Soviet Union. And when we think about how, there's the external threat and there's the internal threat, right? And we know that in the Soviet Union, political correctness was a concept that every citizen understood. Politically correct meant that this is what you're allowed to say, this is what you're allowed to articulate, and if you go beyond that, then you're off to the gulag, right? And today, the internal manifestation of police thought, which includes today also, very strict script about how you can describe terrorism, how you can and how you can talk about the Muslim population, right? But people don't understand that politically correct today is no different than politically correct in the Soviet Union. You go beyond that script, you deviate in any way, and you become isolated. You become tainted. You're then a racist or an Islamophobe, the two terms that are the worst things that anybody could be called today, right? You could be called an anti-Semite and survive, but to be called a racist or an Islamophobe, and so it gets to the level of, I don't know if this is happening in the UK, but in America, if a white woman wears hoop earrings like these, I will get accused of cultural appropriation. There were two women who went to Mexico, two white women who went to Mexico to study how to make the best tacos. And they learned how to make the best tacos, and they came back to the States and they opened up a restaurant. Well, they were shut down really quickly. They had to close because they were culturally misappropriating.
Which is funny, because what made America great is, you notice, our culture is universal. You know, if you look back to the French,
It's so
you
universal.
couldn't attain, it was only for the elites. Our culture is down and dirty and mundane and base, and everybody loves it. We don't charge for it.
Right. But what I'm saying is that so that's another manifestation of the assault on freedom of expression. We can't even express ourselves creatively or however we want. We can't show admiration for other cultures without the threat of being accused as robbing and thieving, being imperialistic towards these cultures, right? So I think I just wanted us to consider that it's also come from, and keep in mind that a lot of the leadership in the Islamist movements, in the Palestinian movements, and the general Islamist movements, even the ANC, leadership from there, many of them studied in Moscow.
So I think it's important to point out that nobody's going to gulags, or very few people are going to gulags today when they're politically incorrect. They get isolated. If you're a professor, you're not going to get invited to contribute to volumes, to come to conferences, to speak at campuses and so on. But it's not quite.
Some might say that there, for instance, in the UK, that there has been somebody who's been sent to the modern day gulag.
Yeah, but that's, I mean, like Hedeker in France, who's under sort of house arrest or house surveillance. And that does happen to some people, but it's not like the state is involved in mass roundups and millions of people are being sent off to Siberia. But your larger point is right, which is that political correctness has become a kind of dogma in which there are some very severe lines that are being reinforced. What I think your point about the hostility to cultural appropriation, which incidentally would mean that if we were to sort of get rid of all cultural appropriation, Islam and Christianity would have to go out because they've culturally appropriated Judaism and, in the case of Islam, Judaism and Christianity. But I think that one of the things that's involved there is this whole victimology, in which you identify certain groups as marginal and underrepresented and so on. And these are the groups that you have to be enormously sensitive of their feelings. And once you've identified a group as privileged, which in many cases is a synonym for successful, like the Jews. I mean, the Jews, before World War II, even in America, Jews were colored people. They were people of color. They were not white. And now we're the whitest of the white, partly because we've been so successful. So the Palestinians are not successful, so they're designated good victims who deserve all the sympathy and all the care and all the indulgence necessary, and other groups not. And that's how you can get something like the Livingston effect. And I think that this issue of, who is a designated victim, designated as a good victim, not designated as somebody to be victimized, it has a lot to do with this kind of atmosphere of fear in which, you can't even positively identify.
One thing which we see in communism was disinformation. Disinformation basically to say wrong things for others to make them look very evil. In Islam, there's different type of disinformation. They are disseminating information about Islam to promote it, which is not true. Like as I mentioned earlier, Gloria, like in In USA, there are 38 books taught in state school from grade 6 to grade 12. Part of sections of those books are promoting Islam. All the lies are taught in those books. And I have heard and I've met people who become Muslim because of the influence of those teachings. So that's disinformation in a different form. And you're not supposed to criticize that because that will be, and that's very sad. Like people are allowed to tell lies to promote their lies, and you're not allowed to tell that what they're doing is lying.
That's the unashamed thing. I lie, but if you call me a liar, I kill you.
Yeah.
My son I sent to Jewish schools, partly because I was scared of state education here in the UK. But he still comes home talking total tripe about climate and what have you. It's all this very PC and up with people, and we gotta love our neighbors. And I'm not against loving your neighbor, don't get me wrong, but you try and correct them on some things. It's like, oh no, because Mrs. So and so said, and already you're picking up the vibes of you're the bigot. I mean, from your 6, 5, 6, 7-year-old, because the way they were taught is, you have to be a nice person, and this is how it's defined to be a nice person. And if you should say, well, I am a nice person. I think so and so is nice, but there's certain practices that I don't agree with, or there's certain things in the world I don't agree with, or scientifically, I know it's hard to explain maybe to someone who's 5, because they probably know more than you do on those topics, including the computer and its use. But you can't do it. You're shut up by a 5-year-old who's been indoctrinated and programmed by his school, and that's, like I said, that's the good Jewish school where it's getting a good education. Versus God knows what's going on at Nelson Mandela, elementary school down in Shoreditch or wherever. So this is partly what we're up against. But they're also, the other problem we have is they're no longer teaching kids how to think, and how to think independently and logically, and to make arguments and to forensically look at something. So it's like I said, this is where I talk about the fox hunting thing. You can't get people to again, I'll present something and say, listen, I don't expect you to buy into fox hunting. I don't expect you to buy into Judaism or whatever, but can I at least try and show you a fact and nicely take you through where you're wrong and explain. You will explain something and it will still look at you and say, you're a baby killer. Because they cannot think for themselves. The best one I heard was one day I was listening to Colin, and I'll try and stop the analogy of fox hunting soon. Maybe it's all bottled up.
Yeah.
Fox hunting relates. But again, just a good illustration. I was listening to Colin Ross many years ago on Radio 4. This is when I think the first private members bill came up. And this lady comes on, very much anti-hunting, yada, yada, yada. And I think it was the host, Nick Ross, that he said, they mentioned the fact of maybe she'd seen a dead fox at the side of the road, and Nick Ross or someone pointed out, yes, a majority of foxes actually die from getting hit. When they get old, they get lame, they get hit by a car, and unfortunately, it's a very unpleasant death where they'll sit there freezing to death and starving to death at the side of the road. This is a process that can take 2, 3, 4 days of suffering. And the woman said, "Oh, good, I'm glad. Better that than they should all die from hunting." And this is the level of logic you're dealing with. And G.K. Chesterton, who said, societies don't get conquered, essentially, they commit suicide. And that's, I think, what is going on in the West right now. We are, in a sense, committing suicide because, as I think we brought up the other night when we were looking at the preview of the film, we're losing a lot of these institutions. We're losing our ability to think, our ability to stand up. We're all becoming tribal to our media, which, if you know how to at least view it properly, okay, but, it's all either one way or the other, and no one reads anything on the other side. It's all echo chamber, and it's all narrative. So again, the Palestinians are victims, and God forbid, the other day, it's like, it was 7-1, 7 Palestinians got killed, maybe, all their own fault, and only 1 Jew, and that's a lopsided score, in baseball and football, and obviously that's just not fair. I don't know, maybe we have to have somebody, IDF members or Jewish babies and children walk up and cut their own throats or something just to eat in the store. But this is the level of logic that we're working with when they put forward these narratives on what proportionalism is and so forth and so on. So we're up against it both from how it's the narrative and the ability to assemble the narrative.
I saw something very interesting last week. A black Jewish professor addressing a very large crowd at Birkbeck University. And he said things that we could never say. He said that slavery and colonialism didn't begin in the 15th century with whites. They started a long time before. And we all got good and we got bad within our groups. And he got cheered and clapped. But it was his blackness that allowed him to say things that we in this room could not say because of that. It was actually an illuminating and very pleasant sensation.
I would suspect, though, that if he said that to a largely black audience, he would get attacked.
There were a lot of black, but British black, not
British
American.
black.
He's American. There were a lot of British black people, there were a lot of Muslims in the community as well, in the room.
Did he mention the role of Islam in slavery, or?
I think it actually was touched on within, because he said slavery wasn't a white industry.
Right.
It was run, he did actually mention, because somebody brought up Jews being part of the slave owning. And he said, yes, there were Jews, and there were Muslims, and there were blacks, and there were, and he got away with it. If a white person had said that, it would have been shut down immediately.
There's an interesting fact on Thomas Sewell, Professor Sewell. I believe I remember from his book. Was it Black Liberals and White? Is it that title right? But essentially said that not only was there slavery obviously before the United States came to being, but what was interesting and different about that slavery was that's the first time people were enslaving essentially their own. So you get them back to saying, well, who was actually selling these people into slavery? Think back to other slave trade. There was times you'd go into a village, you'd kill the men up, you'd take the women and children, and those would get sold into slavery. These were people selling their own.
Well, I'm sorry. I just want to say one thing quickly, and then I'd love to hear you speak more. When we talk about origins or earliest instances of slavery, it's curious to me that we're not talking about the Israelites being enslaved by the Egyptians. I mean, we're talking about the earliest slaves as our people.
Got slavery
Never
goes
comes
to
up. Never
Foreign
comes
beings.
up. Yeah. Okay.
Like slavery was very common from the very beginning of Islam. Muhammad owned many slaves, and like in Torah we see people are allowed to have Jewish slaves, but after in 70 they have to set them free. So there was freedom attached with that. In Islam, you're slave for life, and not only that, in Islam, it says in the Quran, those women who have the right and control your right of sex with them. It goes further. That's in Surah 4 verse 10. It's called Surah 24 verse 33 says that force not your slave girl for prostitution. Like you have right to have sex with them, but don't force them to go for prostitution so they can earn money for that. That's Surah 24 verse 30. And then it says, if you force them for prostitution, Allah is forgiving and merciful. It's a very different type of slavery in Islam. And not only they will have slave here, Allah promises slave in paradise as well. That Muslims will own many slaves. So slavery is a integral part of Islam from the very beginning.
Which is interesting. Just on the last quick final point, when people try and excoriate the United States and our Constitution, what do they usually say? Well, look who wrote it. It's a bunch of white slave owners. Some were. But it was, in those days, many weren't into slave ownership, but it was part of society. As the Colonel once said, what was it? Our history was their present.
And I'd like to pose a question to you, is that each era of life brings a different way that people live, and different rules that people live by. And what we seem to find today is that the rules of the past are all being smashed and not being remembered, that we lived in a different time. And that now, for instance, when I grew up in the 50s and 60s, men and women were very different, and the woman was at home, and the Hoover came in, and they were advertised, and the woman very much had to do the cleaning, and the man was at home, being looked after, having his pipe, and going out to work and earning a living. And it seems to me that society now is trying to erase that completely and make it and almost criminalize the way people used to live. And I'd like to know if you have any comments on that and what effect that is having on young people today, basically.
So one problem with that is that in Islam, everything is enshrined in the book Quran and then in Hadith. So we can change what's happening now, but in Islam they have to change the holy book. They're not prepared to do that. And because Allah allows that, and Allah has promised to have slaves in Quran, it says that practice, common practice of Muhammad, to go to some wicked tribe, kill men, took the women and children, and have sex with them for 3 days. It was called temporary marriage, and then sell them into slavery. So that's from the very beginning. And so they are bound by their book, and that's where the big problem comes. Like it said in Hadith, many of these say that the day of judgment will not come till there's a whole slaughter of the Jews. So that's a very evil thing, but that's what Muhammad taught in Hadith. So they believe that we have to be prepared for that. So that's something we need to be made public so that people will be aware of that. This is their teaching of the Holy Book. And going back to America again, in the state school they're telling that how Muhammad is so kind and loving and caring. But for Islamic school, there's a book written by Amir Yahya says what Islam is all about, and he tells that how Muhammad got rid of all the Jews living in Medina, including slaughtering all the Jews of Bani Qurayza. So that's in the Islamic book for Muslim children to learn that, so their minds are prepared to do something in the future. But in the public school, it was so loving, so caring. So there are all these things we need to bring in balance and make it public so that the people are.
I'm not sure how that would be possible though, because then it would be Islamophobia. It's not really true, and Islam's a religion of peace. And Islamophobia laws have now just come in.
The UK is completely set in that mindset.
It's insane.
You cannot say things like that.
It's the Twilight Zone. I feel like I'm in the Twilight Zone.
As true as it is, you cannot say things like that.
And that's something
They
that
will
we have.
demonise you.
This is something that we have to make more.
See, we're already onto
So
What we have to do, we have to make more concerted effort so it become more public. And they cannot put thousands of people in jail. And when everybody knows that they're reading from Quran, reading from Hadith, reading from Islamic history, then what they have to do, they have to accept it that these are the reality.
But we have to change that.
No, what I was going to say, I'm afraid they can put 1,000 people in jail, and they would put 1,000 people in jail for hate crime on social media.
I'm actually sitting here. I'm actually sitting here and wondering what our audience is thinking about, because we know that certain people in our community are watching this, and we also know that certain people in the wider community are watching this. And I'm wondering what's going to happen when this statement is heard on our program, and who we might hear from in the future. This is how it is here. You know, I say this a lot. I'm born in South Africa, and I grew up in a police state. I know exactly what it is to be silent, but really silent, where you don't even tell your parents what you're thinking about because you're too frightened. And when I came here 50 years ago, it was like the most wonderful breath of fresh air. It's like I dived off a huge cliff into a cool water, and it woke me up. And now I'm afraid, I'm actually more frightened now to speak than I was in South Africa. So this is what we face here in the UK.
I want to remind you one thing. We all know the Old Testament. You know David, he was a young man, he was a shepherd boy. Army of Israel was terrified of Goliath because they were looking at Goliath and they were fearful. But David's eyes were on God, and he won the victory. So let's not look at the elephant and look at the giants, but look at God. He is still in control. And I believe we need to harness a larger community, get involved in that, and I believe God will give us victory because He is in control of all history.
Can I just say?
I'd like to respond to Sharon's comment, because there's a very interesting book by Professor at Princeton, Anthony Kwame Appiah, called The Honor Code and Moral Revolutions. And one of the things he points out is that the modern world has seen a kind of literally a flipping of what's considered honorable. So Previously, being a slave owner in the South, being a slave owner was a mark of honor. Being a slave was a mark of disgrace. Duels were honorable. He has four cases: duels, slavery, foot binding, and honor killings. And the one case where the revolution didn't occur is, in fact, he deals with Pakistan, and how there was an effort to try and tackle it, so it failed. But the fact is that in the modern world, we actually live by an inversion of what has traditionally been the definition of what's honorable and what's good. What's happened today is that instead of appreciating the process whereby we came to that, there's an effort to literally wipe out the past and impose this new ideology, really cut and dried, cut off from its roots, cut off from its transformation, so that you can then focus on America as shamed by its past as a slaveholder, rather than America as the only country in the world that actually voluntarily renounced, well, voluntarily, it was quite a war, but of their own decision, decided to get rid of slavery. So I think you're right. There is this sort of disastrous dogmatization of the proper attitude. So, for instance, to get back to the subject of our panel, which is free speech, and to get back to, what's the fellow in the Guardian you were from? Yeah, Owen Jones. You know, he has a piece on freedom of speech, and he says, you know, but bigotry is clearly something that we don't want to tolerate. Well, you know, who defines what bigotry is, you know? And there are schools, and there was an interesting case, I forget the name of the school, but the editor of the school newspaper admitted, in passing, it wasn't even like, you know, this was a big thing for him, it was just a standing policy: we don't publish any article that defends Israel, because that's considered bigoted. And so, you know, you end up defining bigotry in such a way as a whole range of material literally can't be brought before the public because it's already been branded as unacceptable.
And the public misses out. I got done by the radio authority once on, I was using something like, again, I won't go into the topic because I've covered the topic before. But let's just say, I was comparing it to attitudes towards homosexuality. And I said, oh yeah, people think this practice is, you know, dirty and horrible and immoral. I said, well, there are people that think that gays are dirty, immoral, etc. And next thing you know, it was as if and I said, this is what John Gaunt, the court case at the time, when he was called counselor Nazi or something to that effect. And his main point was, he said, wait a minute, radio station defends itself against an off-palm charge, not the presenter. So as was with me, so there was no way for me to explain to saying, well, I wasn't saying I think gays are dirty and whatever. I said, I was saying this is what some people think, and if you're offended by that, well, good, that's what I want you to be. I want you to be offended. I want you to think, how dare they say that about people just because they're gay? And how dare they also say it about this person, you know, about something I do because, you know, just because they don't like it. If you don't like it, you don't like it, but, you know, it's the right to offend people at times.
Yeah, I mean, to just further, you don't need me to substantiate, but to take further what you just said, quite remarkably, it was either yesterday or today, I get mixed up with the difference in the time zones. The New York Times ran a piece on how it was the left who used to support freedom of speech, and today it is the right that is supporting freedom of speech. And the reason that the left is no longer supporting freedom of speech is because it means then that the right will have the right to speak.
Right. And also the left is now in control of the public sphere, so they get to see.
And Catherine McKinnon came out with a statement saying that she can't support freedom of speech anymore because it gives
bigots.
the bigots the right.
She said that?
Yes.
And that's Owen Jones. That's the article I read just before coming.
I read it from the Legal Insurrection. That article, that's why I'm asking if it was in the New York Times.
So the logic is, in order to have freedom, they've got to restrict freedom.
Restrict freedom only.
No, in order to be
To the
good.
right.
Well, in order to be, yes, in order to have value, in order for freedom to have value, it needs to serve the left, but nobody else.
Let see itself as morally superior.
In order to
So-
be a decent person, you need to defend bigotry
Right.
perpetrated against you, but you can't
Well,
defend yourself.
it's the left's use of intolerance in the fight against intolerance.
So there's a really interesting phenomenon that as a historian I'd like to bring up. It's a very interesting book called Tolerance in the Protestant Reformation. And the conclusion, it's a collection of essays, the conclusion in the paper, Bob Scribner, was that tolerance is a loser's creed. In other words, when you're a minority, you're all for tolerance, you're all for freedom of religion. Once you become the majority, then God gave you the right to impose the true religion, and all of a sudden, once you're a majority, you're no longer committed to tolerance and freedom of religion. The United States Constitution is the first time in the history of Christianity that tolerance was a winner's creed. And that ability to be tolerant when you can actually get away with being intolerant is the true test of character. And I would say right now that the people who call themselves progressive and call themselves liberals are failing.
And the thing is that the left now has moved from sort of centre left to now far left, and it's
Right.
become fascistic, really.
And the moderates in the middle are either too cowardly or I think cowardly. I think they just, instead of saying, oh my God, this is completely inappropriate, it violates progressive values, and instead of calling these people to order, they let them get away with it.
Well, yeah, but we do have to recognize that what's going on if we're looking at the United States, what's going on in the Democratic Party now is that those that are in the Democratic Party who are truly classic liberals, right, the moderates, they're being pushed out.
Right.
Moderate.
The new Reagan Democrat. That's Trump.
Well,
Let's
I mean, I think that what we really need to zoom in on is the fact that those Democrats who one used to be able to rely on for supporting Israel, those Democrats who really held and valued classic liberal values, they are being shoved out. They are winning, and the progressives, and let's be clear about what progressives mean. They're really totalitarians. The totalitarians who are self-identifying themselves as progressives are doing a purge of the Democratic Party.
And
And that's exactly what's happening here with the Labour Party.
right.
Oh, yeah.
The momentum and the hard left, shutting down and threatening to deselect moderate Labour MPs.
Well, they have gone to the hard left in England.
Yeah.
I was referring to England.
Right.
You mentioned Richard, quite interestingly, you said you called them cowards. Could you explain who you actually are referring to when we're not standing up for free speech? Who are these cowards that you refer to?
I'll give you an example that cuts close to home, which is on matters of Israel. Starting in 2000, with the outbreak of the Intifada and what I call a massive episode of lethal journalism by Western journalists who were passing on Palestinian war propaganda as news, the hard left went bonkers, started comparing Israel to Nazis and so on and so forth. And the academic world, which had already been colonized by anti-Orientalists in the Said tradition and so on, there were still plenty of people who knew, that this was completely off the wall. They wouldn't stand up. They wouldn't say anything. I mean, Dershowitz used to complain that, you'd go to the Middle East people and they'd say, well, it's my field, I have to remain objective, I can't be seen to be taking sides. And then you'd go to the people who are outside the field but who knew what was going on, and they say, well, it's not my field, and so on. And the fact is that there's this massive silence from the people who should be sort of the ballast of progressive, liberal values. And instead, a lot of us just ended up finding ourselves cast off. I mean, I think that real liberals now are a diaspora community.
Oh, we're talking mainly about journalists, because
And
without the
journalists.
journalists giving us a voice,
Right.
and they haven't been doing that, that's where we have
Oh,
the
and
issue.
well, I mean, Melanie made this remark last 2 nights ago when I asked her about journalism, and she said, "Look, starting in 1989 with the Salman Rushdie affair, the journalists just scurried for cover, and the cover that they scurried for is this: I am a good person, I am magnanimous, I don't want to hurt the feelings of Muslims," and basically what you're saying is, I'm a dhimmi.
But that's really not quite accurate. They scurried for cover. There's a culture in the media that is left-wing. For instance, it's well known in the BBC that The Guardian is a newspaper of choice. You will not find another newspaper there.
Right.
This culture of left-wingism is intrinsic to the press, and they propagate it. They actually, they further this whole idea. They feed it to the population.
I'd agree with you, but I think that, first of all, Melanie's talking about something that happened 30 years ago. So, over the last 30 years, I think the media and journalists, and certainly in Israel we feel this, it attracts people who do this kind of stuff, and you get socialized into it. But that's not always been the case with the media. The media hasn't always been a sort of dogmatic left wing. I think that a lot of it has to do with this situation of intimidation today.
But it also has an economic motive. And since the 70s, when the economy was really, the print media, mainstream media was having a tough time economically, and they had to make a decision, who was their market? They each made a decision. The Wall Street Journal defined their market, the New York Times defined their market, and that's who they spoke to. It all became, what does our audience want to read? And that's what they wrote to.
Well, I mean, there's an interesting book called The History of the Partisan Press in the United States, and partisan press has been with us for a very long time. If anything, there was this sort of moment in the 50s and the 60s where you had a media that was committed to some kind of impartiality and professionalism.
They had the checklist for accuracy. It was all about accuracy, but that changed in the 70s.
It's become, on the TV side, it's become entertainment. You have a couple things. Kelvin McKenzie once said something I thought was very propitious as a former editor. He said the minute when journalists went from the assets column to an expense column is when it all changed. And also, what I noticed in television is they don't almost care what the arguments are. They'll find any kook put up against someone because they want a bun fight, they want entertainment. The minute things are flying, it's entertaining TV.
Actually, if you watch Gavin Esler on the BBC, he's got a panel of 5 people who are Tweedledee, Dum, Dum, and Doom. It's miles from anything, and he gets one guy to represent the Israeli point of view, and it's the Haaretz correspondent, It's like, so that's not.
Investigation is smarter about this one as well.
I was saying about I was at SOAS.
Right.
People were scared to talk to me in public because I said what I wanted to say. And as some people said, if we talk to you, we will lose our friends.
Right.
And academics said we will lose all our contacts with academia.
Right. I was at a talk that Phyllis Chesler gave to some Jewish women in New York, and one after another, these women who are in their 50s and 50s got up and said, "I have a kid in college who's afraid to defend Israel because they'll lose all their friends."
Yeah.
So there's this gets to, I think this is one aspect of, there are a variety of ways in which freedom of expression is limited, and one of them is this kind of social shaming and excommunication.
Social
Shunning. What?
Social gulag.
Social gulag. Yes. There, you're right, and it's gold.
Can I just say that Jewish leadership in this country official leadership are exactly as you just described. I don't know what it is, but I know they have to do this interfaith thing, and they get into bed with Islam, and they are so much embedded with them that if you try and warn them against it, or criticize Islam, or criticize how far they've got in with them, they just go completely nuts. And they call you disgraceful, disgraceful, a bigot, racist, all sorts of things. And not only that, this person actually physically, she literally found out, she knows where I work, she complained about me at my job. And had I not already left, I would have been out the door. So they are so, I don't know how to describe it.
She's got a very good position now.
She's got a very good position now.
So,
and she said, I'm all for diversity, I'm
except
all
for my people.
Except for when someone disagrees with you.
You know,
no, go ahead.
it would be a different situation if the leadership decided that they were going to work with the true reformers
On the other
in
side.
Islam
Right.
to empower them rather than disempower them by working with the totalitarians in Islam.
Except they don't see them as totalitarians because these people are fooling them hook, line, and sinker.
Well, because they're not threatened by those who are really trying, whether they'll be able to succeed or not, that's a different issue. But there's no empowerment by working with them. In their minds, the empowerment is working with the totalitarians because the biggest shift is that maybe they won't get killed.
Daniel, speak
Yes.
a little bit about this reform.
Actually, what they're doing is appeasement thing. This reform is more on a paper. It's like a reformer, they cannot live very long if they're in Pakistan. They're killed pretty soon. As you know, even not reformer, one of the, governor of Punjab, he just spoke to one lady who was in jail, and his bodyguard killed him there. 26 bullets in his body. Because how he dared to side with a Christian, telling her that she had been wrongly put in jail. She has been in jail for now 7 years because she offered a cup of water to Muslims, and that's insult to Islam, and she's in jail for 7 years.
On the subject of these very aggressive Jewish leaders attacking tribal Israel firsters, I think that one of the things involved in this is what I call a proxy honor killing. In other words, they are deeply shamed by, not so much by Israel as the image of Israel presented in the press. So the press presents the IDF as baby killers and so on and so forth. This deeply shames them. And as in response to that, on the one hand, they're trying desperately to show their distance from that, and therefore their distance from anybody who would even try and defend what Israel's doing. And then on the other hand, they literally side with the people who will do the honor killing. They don't have the nerve to actually do the honor killing, but they will side with groups like, Jewish Voice for Peace will side with groups like Students for Justice and Just Us in Palestine, and so on. And you get this really disturbing phenomenon. We who defend Israel become pariahs, and the main figures to make us pariahs are our Jewish leaders who are trying desperately to appease both their liberal progressive colleagues, who control a lot of the public sphere, and trying to appease the people everybody's afraid of, which is what I call the caliphators.
It brings me to a question that I had even earlier that comes on the same lines, and that is, in a sense, how we got to this place where the term tikkun olam, I know is very important in Jewish religion, but it's almost become, in my mind, I don't mean this offensively, but it's almost become a sort of an arrogant, lefty, politically correct statement. I get these organizations that get to believe their own press. And I'm seeing that now with people in the Jewish religion. mainly obviously on the left, and sort of like you say, Jewish voices, etc.
Social justice.
Yeah, social justice to the point where, you know, I don't know, what is the story of it, was it the man who puts the scorpion on his shoulder, you know, lives across the river, and the scorpion says, I promise.
Crocodile with a scorpion.
Yeah, you know, I promise I won't bite the person who does, because that's what scorpions do. But I sometimes, I'll reference just really, and I think sometimes we're committing suicide. We've so lost our values, we so think we've regained our values, that we've turned everything right on its head.
So also our chief rabbi is I just couldn't believe what he did, you know, when in 2016 when the refugee crisis was at its peak. He actually went over to Greece to see for himself the refugee camps, and they're all Muslim refugees. And he was advised on the way there in the coach. He was advised to take his kippah off, or at least cover it with a baseball cap, because these people that you're going to address, they might not like it if they see your kippah on your head. So he obliged, and he goes there and he gives them a talk and tells them how they all remind him of his own people and what they went through in Auschwitz. And that disgusted me, I'm sorry, but it disgusted me.
It's disgusting.
On so many levels, He had to cover his Jewishness, his identity, and he goes there and he sells his soul to the devil, basically, by comparing the two situations, which are totally incomparable.
Invoking the Holocaust at every given opportunity regarding the
And for what? For virtue signaling. For what other purpose?
Virtue signaling.
Yeah.
Well, there was something quite interesting that happened a few weeks ago. I think it was about 150 French, I don't know what level they were, that sent a message to Islam to say, you have to remove some of the verses from your Quran because they are anathema to the current viewpoints. But so far they've been pillared on every side by everybody.
Okay, so what we've got here in the UK, I think as I mentioned it the other night a little bit, is the moving into the Jewish area of a Muslim community. And I heard today one of the repercussions that we feared when we objected to this, that a Jewish lady from America was walking up the street near the Jewish Community Center, JW3, and two ladies in a hijab with a few children around them turned around and called her a something Jew. This is something that we feared would happen in our area, that people would come in and insult us, where they see Jews in a crowd and insult us. And a few weeks ago, outside that same community center, came people from the Islamic Human Rights Commission. They came to protest the visit of an ex-Israeli Prime Minister. And they called him a killer, a child killer, and a Palestinian killer in the presence of police, and they were not arrested. And my question really is, if we went down the road to that new mosque and we stood out there and we protested, we would all have been arrested.
Of course.
You know, this is really what's going down in this country. So we have here Pastor Daniel, who has suffered that and had to run away from his own country because of it. Is that right?
That's right.
So they arrested him and they put you in prison, or tried to put you in prison.
They actually, the Cardinal I should have been put to death in Pakistan. So
And it's kind of coming our way.
In Australia, the judge initially decided against me that if I don't apologize to Muslim, I will be in jail for 6 months. That's when I'm happy to go to jail. But I'm not going to apologize for telling truth. This theory of appeasement seems like good to some people. What one of the Israeli ministers said, useful idiots, he said, use that term.
Yeah, useful idiots.
So it's like it's a famous period that you feed the crocodile, hoping that you'll be the last one to eat it.
Right.
And
That's
that's
appeasement.
Yeah, that's a period. So it's not a nice thing.
But the British government is in full scale, and the police force is in full scale appeasement mode. You don't know how to change their minds without being labelled, very badly labelled, and also if it gets to your employer, a lot of people are afraid to lose their jobs.
That happened to me, by the way, in 2002. I gave a talk at Harvard. was critical of Islam. People got up and walked out, and a letter was sent by the organizer of the talk to my chair, saying I was not a true progressive. Now, fortunately, my chair wasn't an idiot, but it could have destroyed my career.
Well, we had an activist who we think took his life because of that kind of threat.
Well, I suppose Tommy Robinson is actually a perfect example. You don't have to support him, but he was arrested, he was put on trial, and he was convicted in 4 hours, which is unheard of in this country.
Well,
So
wait a
wanted to bring
minute.
that
You're
to-
talking about the second case, and that was a violation of parole. It wasn't.
Yeah, but nowhere in this country would anybody get arrested. That was actually abuse of the law to silence somebody in an awkward position. Because in this country, you'll get arrested, they'll take you to jail, they'll keep you all day in jail, they'll fill out the forms, and then they'll say, come back to court in a week's time. But he was convicted within 4 hours. That was a political setup, basically.
And denied his own lawyer.
Yeah.
So I wanted to bring the conversation back to that before we start honing in to completing the evening. That what caused us to call this roundtable about free speech 2018 was in fact what happened to Tommy Robinson. I think everybody knows that Tommy Robinson came out of Luton objecting to the very things we've been talking about when there was a parade of commemorating the dead soldiers in, I think, the Iraq War, and they were defiled by certain people in that community in Luton. And so he came out of that, and he was naive, and he somehow got caught up in a little bit of extremism. But he's grown from there. He's a man who's now become very knowledgeable about what he's talking about. But they're still trying to take him off the streets. And what I've noticed is more and more people are wearing I Love Tommy shirts. People that you wouldn't have thought would come out for a man like this. And when he was arrested, 4,000 odd people came on the streets within minutes. I don't know a politician that can call that sort of community. So can we talk a little bit about this groundswell that we're beginning to feel?
Yeah, I suspect that if Tommy Robinson was of a different class, let's say if he was an academic, and he was engaged in civil disobedience. Now, civil disobedience is, from an activist perspective, is something that is honorable, right? And many civil disobedient activists would do that. They would go back again and do it because there needed to be a light shined on the fact that this had been covered up, that the rapes had been covered up, and that people had a right, citizens had a right to know what was going on. But because, and I apologize right now, and I just want to state I am not a Marxist, I am not a socialist. But in this case, because of his status as not an educated person, that it's uncomfortable.
You mean classically educated?
Yes, classically educated. It is uncomfortable for those some who would even speak out against the grooming and against the silence, but because of where he comes from, there's a ickiness to them, and they don't want to associate with him.
But what's interesting, I was thinking this the other night when we were at the theater, and I heard you mention you were from Boston, and me being the same, I immediately thought of Henry David Thoreau, and besides, writing on Walden Pond, he wrote a book on civil disobedience, and this was about not paying federal income tax because, of course, we were still a slave-owning country. But his definition, or his quote was, what was it? The only place for an honest man in a dishonest world is in prison.
So I think that that's important for us to think about. I'm not saying that you have to accept it, but I would ask everybody to just be reflective about that and think about it. Is that a possibility that we are uncomfortable with?
For sure.
Okay, so that's one thing. And I think that he's, from my perspective, all power to him. I mean, he got up and he went back and did what he felt needed to be done. And that is why there's such ground swelling among the people.
And he became educated.
Yes.
He became knowledgeable.
And that's why
just-
there's a big fear against a lot of the intelligentsia or academia are actually quite worried about what he represents today.
Yeah.
Because there's people who, he didn't do it. I don't support him because of his politics. I support him because he was silenced, because he was saying what he wanted to say.
So one of the interesting things here is, first of all, the whole issue around this, the grooming scandal, is so shameful. And it's so
Absolutely.
shameful at such a staggering level. It's the police, it's the school system, it's the health officials, it's the courts, I mean, across the boards, at the highest levels of people who are supposed to be responsible and serving the people, and utter abandonment on a massive scale. For so long, it's staggering. Along comes somebody who wants to denounce it, and the hysteria is about him. This is classic displacement. I mean, this is like, you know, the Germans becoming anti-Zionists. They're ashamed of the Holocaust. They're not guilty about the Holocaust. They're ashamed of the Holocaust. So what do? They want to shame Israel and get themselves out of the spotlight. And this is real displacement.
I got the impression from Melanie Phillips on Sunday that she was not mentioning any names. And she was
Well, Melanie's not here, so
No,
she's not here
it's-
to make her case. So I don't think we should.
No.
Yeah.
But we can still discuss it.
And I think we also
Roughly.
need to understand that there are people who believe that because there's an ongoing court case about it, that they shouldn't discuss it. So we need to understand that perspective as well.
So, but let's say Tommy Robinson is the reason, the sort of provoking cause of this discussion, but there's a broader issue which Tommy Robinson's involved in, and that is that there has been a systematic effort to identify anybody critical of Islam as a xenophobe, a right-winger, etc. A lot of these people are not xenophobes. They're not against other immigrant groups. They are worried about Islam, and the very term Islamophobia is a ludicrous term, because a phobia is an irrational fear, and there are lots of good reasons to be afraid of certainly certain strains of Islam, which are dominant in majority Muslim countries like Pakistan, and have a tremendously powerful voice in the communities in the West, so that people like, if we're from Boston, Jasser, who is a genuine, moderate American civil society Muslim, and he is vilified by the Muslim community. That should be a sign to us that we should be worried about the Muslim community, not that we should say, oh, well, he's not a real Muslim. And so the real problem here is the failure of liberals and progressives to address the problem of Islam has created a vacuum into which a number of people, some of them savory and some of them less than savory, have moved in. And instead of the progressives identifying the problem amongst themselves and their failure to address the issue, what they've done is to assault the people who do address it. And again, I think this is a form of displacement. They behave shamefully, and they don't want people showing them up, especially, as you point out, lower class white trash.
Right. And I apologize to those who were there Sunday evening, for repeating this, but I do highly recommend that everybody try to read Daniel Pike's piece on civilizationalism, because I think it's very important. He wrote this piece entitled Civilizationalism, where he helps us understand that the movements that are rising in Europe are all defamed as ultra-right, fascists, etc. But in fact, they are not all ultra-right fascist organizations. Many of them are good and decent people that want to protect and sustain Western culture. And we should be identifying them as civilizationalists, because that's what they are.
And not xenophobic racist.
Right.
You know, something happened also a few weeks ago, Southern Poverty Law Centre.
Oh, yeah.
They lost the
They
case.
said Majid, no, what's his name?
Majid
Majid
Nawaz.
He's won $3.5 million from them
Yep.
because they had to backtrack. And that's actually what it's all about. Once you stand up to them,
Right.
their pack of cards collapses.
Yes. Yeah, I definitely think that one of the things we need to do is to pick certain things. Ron Schleifer went to the Imperial War Museum. So there's a Reuters Jeep on exhibit with the account of how the IDF killed the Reuters journalists.
Oh,
And right, and he said, you know, I don't know the details, I haven't looked into them, but he said, you know, if you look into this, it's not a true story, it's a narrative. And that should be made an issue. You know, the more times you pick this stuff, which is fake news, not just misinformation, but disinformation, you nail those things and you rub the noses of the people who claim to be good journalists and good museum curators and good culture, information professionals, and you force them to retract.
We want to get some final statements. We'll start with Daniel.
Yeah, I think that, you know, there's a, say, that many people have wishbone, very long wishbone, but we need people with backbone. That's what's needed. We have wishbone, but matter will not be solved with backbone. And I can give my own illustration. When I had a court case, I have no money to fight with Islamic Council of Victoria. They told me all 56 Islamic nations are taking this case very seriously, especially government of Pakistan and government of Saudi Arabia. And my response was they will learn all of them will learn something good about it. So I stood the ground and my God grace won it in the Supreme Court. Now my court case has forced the education department in Australia to introduce a new subject in the last school. It's called hate speech and freedom of speech. So that's something where we need to stand ground. And Lord Jesus Christ said, you know the truth will set you free. So finally there will be victory of truth. So we need to proclaim truth and it will win, as I have seen in my life many times.
You know, I was reading some news about the Iranian people who are standing up and being killed for their protesting, but it doesn't stop them. They continue to protest for their freedoms and their rights. And then I think about what we in the West are doing, which is saying, well, we'd like to do something, but we might lose our jobs, or somebody might give us a bad report, or you know, it's like we want to put our toe in the water, but if it's really hot, we're going to pull it out. And we need to each make a decision about whether we want to be a Chamberlain or if we want to be a Churchill. And I pray that we are blessed with many Churchills.
I think the real issue here is the question of courage. It really is, fortunately, at least until now, we don't have a really murderous state that is either eliminating or sending off to Siberia any dissidents. So, in fact, we are still free, we're free to speak. There are consequences to speaking freely. I think we should embrace these consequences and wear them like a badge. I mean, that was Thoreau's comment to Emerson. What are you doing out there? Why aren't you in jail with me? It's
Yes.
why aren't you in exile, being accused of being a xenophobe because you're standing up for the universal values that Western civilization has developed about human dignity and human rights and so on and so forth. And I just, this is a critical moment in history. This is the fight of our lives. And, piece of war propaganda in England. They had a picture of, I think it was in World War II, they had a picture of a father with his grandson, a grandfather with his grandson on his lap, and the kid was saying, "What did you do in the Great War, Daddy?" We're in the Great War. What are you doing?
What should we do?
Well, I think one of the things I tell my son occasionally
Open them out.
is, do what you think is right. And I've said, can be scary. I worry sometimes about my job, but I know what I believe, and I know it to be right. I've thought about it, I've thought about it, I've analyzed it, I cannot speak untruths. It's just not possible for me to tell something I don't believe in. I'm not one of those. My friend James Wales says, he says, well, his style of broadcast, he says, whatever I talk about, I believe it at the time. He's very good at what he does. He's an echo chamber. But, I will take the position I believe in, and it's not to wind somebody up. It's because I think it is true. There's no way I can say anything but. So you have to stand up and be counted. And it should be a natural act. I mean, if I can do it, anybody can. Because I don't think. What's that joke? Some people say I'm ignorant. Other people say I'm apathetic. Personally, I don't know and I don't care. On that happy note, I wish everyone could, be, like I said the other night, be happy warriors. If you call up a George Galloway on the radio, don't shoot it. Just, state the facts in a friendly way. Say, George, I think you're wrong on this. I've studied it, or I've lived there, I've seen it firsthand, and this is what is actually happening. Make sure we get the story out, but again, do it in a friendly, factual way. And, we just keep on battling.
And talk to people. I think it's terribly important that you talk with coworkers, you talk with people, you raise these issues. There's a joke about why are there female astronauts? Because in case they get lost in space, at least somebody will ask for directions. and why don't men ask for directions? Because they don't want to admit they don't know what's going on. And I know that there have been situations where I didn't raise issues because I just didn't want to go through the embarrassment or the hostility or whatever. Take it on.
One other concept very important to keep in mind is that Judeo-Christian values teach us that everybody is human are equal. That's not concept in Islam. In Islam, everybody is slave. So everybody is slave of Allah. And among the slaves, there are ranks. So there's totally upside down thinking. And we need to recognize that the common theme, or the effort of secular humanists and Islam is to eradicate Judeo-Christian values. And that's where we need to work together and to establish that, yes, these are the Judeo-Christian values, and we stand by that. These are the true values. These are the values which uplifted the society and raised West from the. They used to live 2,000 years ago in caves and log houses, but by following these Judeo-Christian values, they've gone up to the moon. And now they're leaving it behind and they're getting toward the gutter.
Right. And the irony is that progressives in principle also share those Judeo-Christian values, but somehow they lost their moorings and they've ended up siding with the enemy.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've been here quite a long time, and we're thanking the people who are here with us, but also the people out there who've tuned in. Despite the football, we've had quite a good reach, so the video will still be there for you to look at. I want to say one thing about knowing things, that many of us don't know a lot about a lot of things, and we were lucky and fortunate to bring Gloria Greenfield here from America with her film called The Fight of Our Lives. I can recommend, pass me a copy of it there, please, this one there. I can recommend, please, that you go on the website, find Gloria. What's the website, Gloria?
TheFightOfOurLives.com.
TheFightOfOurLives.com. We're trying to find a copy of it. There was one just over there. Okay. And we're going to show you what it looks like. Go online, access this video, buy it, take it around to your schools, take it around to your synagogues, your churches, and let people see what is happening in our world today. so that you can devise a way of getting active, of speaking out, and not being afraid to be there as a warrior for your children and your grandchildren in the future. I'd like to thank our panel, Daniel Scot, who's come all the way from Australia, Gloria Greenfield, who's come from America, Richard Landes, who's come from Israel, and Charlie Wolf, who lives in London. It does seem like a bit of an American-weighted program, but we're actually quite a diverse bunch of people around here. Here is the video. Can it be seen on screen? Can you see it?
It's on screen.
Is it on screen?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so go get that video, and thank you very much for
Can I say
watching.
one thing?
Yeah?
There's no silver bullet, and this film is just one of many ways that we can educate people. And I also want to recommend that people read Richard Landes' blogs, Second
Yes.
Draft, which are very important.
Augie and Staples.
Augie and Staples.
Oh, it's not Second
But yeah,
Draft
that's-
The
anymore?
blog is Augie and Staples.
Oh,
Can I just say
Second
something?
draft is where I
The audience have to understand that we here have four of the most incredible people of the great intellect who think, who devote their lives to providing material for you to access so that you can also join in and help your children's future.
As a matter of safety, when we're debating, our words can be twisted and turned and used against us. I tape everything if I'm talking to somebody.
Oh, yeah.
And I carry it. I'm not taping now, but I
Well,
tape.
we have it on there.
But every time, and I have got myself out of people have called me racist, and I have said, I've got it on tape. And that's the evidence.
I recommend that to the Israelis, that when they're being interviewed by the BBC, they should have their own tapes, because the BBC will present it.
And that's as big as it is.
And I would like to recommend something in addition to that, which is to make time for conversations and discussions that are off the record and not filmed. Because one could be much more candid and one could dig much more deeply when you have very candid off the record conversations.
Okay, so we're going to say goodnight to everybody. Thank you guys. We can continue talking afterwards if you want. We've got some great people here.